We're recording.
Welcome to today's presentation, COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic Adaptation and Planning via Neuroscience for Nonprofit Professionals. On behalf of the Society for Nonprofits, we're thrilled that you could join us. Our presenter today is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. Dr. Tsipursky is on a mission to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases by developing the most effective decision-making strategies. His cutting-edge thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues such as CBS News, Time, Business Insider, The Chronicle, Philanthropy, and elsewhere. His expertise stems from his background of over 20 years of consulting, coaching, speaking, and training as CEO of disaster avoidance experts. It also comes from his research background as a behavioral economist and cognitive neuroscientist with over 15 years in academia, with dozens of peer-reviewed articles published in academic journals such as Behavior and Social Issues and Journal of Social and Political Psychology. Welcome, Dr. Tsipursky. We have a group that's eager to get started, so I'll hand the program over to you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, everyone. I'm glad you came, and this is a really important topic, and I'm going to try my best to help you adapt and plan for the future of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, what's going on. So the first thing I want to talk about is how people responded to it. Really prominent people, nonprofit professionals. I work with both for-profit professionals and nonprofit professionals. For-profit professionals tend to have a lot more resources, unfortunately, in our society to get information about things like the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's see how top for-profit professionals who have a lot more resources than, unfortunately, nonprofit professionals responded. Let's start with Elon Musk, one of the best-known entrepreneurs in the world, multi-billionaire, runs Tesla, SpaceX, and other companies. So how did he react to the COVID-19 coronavirus? Well, on March 6th, he tweeted that the coronavirus pandemic is dumb at the time when Italy was undergoing massive shutdowns, huge numbers of people lost, and the coronavirus was, of course, really spreading here in the US. Just a few days after that, on March 15th, a national emergency was declared here in the US by President Donald Trump. And a few days later, Musk tweeted on March 19th that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by end of April. Well, we are close to the end of April, and we just approached about a million cases. It's just past 1 million cases, and of course, new ones are coming up every day. So he's definitely wrong on that. And despite all of his billions and billions and resources, that's one. But let's talk about that's a new money entrepreneur sort of for folk. Let's talk about some old money who have a lot of money and whose expertise is in predicting financial trends, what's going to be happening, and they have a lot of informational sources. Goldman Sachs. So they estimated the US GDP growth in the second quarter. They made an estimate on February 24th, and they said that it would grow by 2.7%. So that was their estimate on February 24th. Then on March 15th, so just 3 weeks later, on February 24th, remember, this was when Italy was undergoing lockdown, so coronavirus was clearly, obviously going to be an issue, and it was starting to be found in the US. On March 15th, they said it will be a 5% decline. So imagine that, US GDP, many trillions of dollars going from 2.7% growth to 5% decline. Obviously, they screwed up something in their analysis. So that was pretty bad. But just 5 days later, let's see what happened. 5 days later, on March 20th, they said it would be a 24% decline. So their estimates in 5 days had the US GDP falling by 19%. So that is a clear indication that the top experts, newish experts, entrepreneurial ones, old experts, old money like Goldman Sachs with extensive source of information and tons of money to throw at getting the right information, made bad mistakes in coronavirus pandemic preparation, adaptation, and planning. What happened? Well, most companies and nonprofits were unprepared as a result. They underestimated the threat. They listened to people like Goldman Sachs. They listened to people like Elon Musk, and they thought, hey, nothing to be too worried about. It's going to be okay. Well, they were greatly underprepared, and they were caught unaware. And this was, of course, a big issue because they responded poorly as they were caught unaware. They turned to their emergency plans, but the emergency plans of nonprofits or for-profits are not a good fit for this situation. And I say this, my expertise is in disaster avoidance. I did a lot of disaster preparedness, business continuity of these emergency plans, and I can tell you they're not a good fit for the situation. Why not? And yeah, many of you might be wondering because you turn to your emergency plans. It's natural to turn to them. They're great for actual emergencies. But COVID-19 is not an emergency, despite what it might seem to be. It's not an emergency. It's a major disruptor. And this is not something you treat as an emergency. It's a slow-moving train wreck. It's hugely high impact. It's long-term. It's global. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so you can't function on an emergency basis using COVID-19 in the context of COVID-19. So it leads to lots of serious problems, which we'll talk about. But let's talk about the facts about COVID-19 so we understand why it's not an emergency, but a major disruptor. It's highly contagious. So every infected person without any suppression, addressing the situation, infects 2 to 3 other people, partially because about half of the people who carry COVID-19 don't know it. They're asymptomatic. And so they just go around infecting people, unfortunately. So you can't tell whether you're infected or not. As a result, the number of cases in any outbreak doubles every 3 to 6 days. And that's an exponential growth. That's a huge growth. There's a risk of serious illness with COVID-19 where about 10 to 20% get seriously ill, and half of those seriously ill need hospitalization. Now, unfortunately, I know this from my own family. My dad's, he's 79, and he lives in New York City. So a couple of weeks ago, I found out that he started coughing badly, having real shortness of breath, and it's very, very likely that he had COVID-19, although due to lack of testing and unfortunate lack of testing, he wasn't able to get tested. But he was pretty sick for a while, and he usually does not get sick like this. And he had the classic symptoms of COVID-19 that aren't associated with other flu-like illnesses. So things like shortness of breath, things like loss of taste. So pretty sure he had it, and he was really touch and go for a while. My mom was thinking about whether to take him to hospitals. Fortunately, she has medical training, so she was able to take the steps to prevent pneumonia at home, and eventually he started to get better. He's still recovering, so hopefully, I very much hope he'll recover safely. But so I know this on my own experience, unfortunately. And it's much more deadly than the flu. So 5.5 to 1% die of the people who get COVID-19, whereas something like 0.1% or so die of the people who get the flu. And there's a much higher death rate for those who are over 60, like my dad, or with underlying health conditions. So anything that suppresses your immune system, any behaviors that suppress your immune system, as well as illnesses, so smoking, stuff like that, those will cause you to be more likely to die and to get seriously ill and die with COVID-19. And if there is a lack of good hospital treatment, so there's no effective treatment currently for COVID-19. It's only the hospitals are the only ones who are going to be treating it. So that there's no effective treatment as such. And if you have effective treatment, if you have just the current treatment base rate, 0.5 to 1% die. Our only hope is a vaccine. That's our goal. That's the vaccine. So it's the only effective solution. Unfortunately, human trials to test both the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine will take at least a year, and that's down from 4 to 5 years. That's the usual rate. This is with all the money thrown at it, all the government regulations that could possibly be being cut. This is going to take about a year if we get lucky in the very optimistic scenario. The vaccine, and the reason it takes a while is that it takes a while to test the safety and the effectiveness, and really most vaccines don't make it for human trials. So it's very unlikely that the first batch of vaccines, which are already in trials, there was one that was in trials from March, around mid-March, most likely they won't make it through all the trials, they won't be successful. And after the vaccine is ready, eventually, then the government would need to coordinate things like the production of this vaccine, the distribution of it, and the actual vaccination itself, fighting the anti-vaxxers, which there's a whole bunch of anti-vaxxers who are strongly opposed to taking vaccine. I saw that from a recent poll published about 3 days ago showed that only 86% of the people would take vaccine if it's available. It means, and that they would, 86% of the people would consider a vaccine. So 14% of the people would definitely not take it. 26% of the people are unsure if they will take it. So if of those who are sure, that's about 60%, and 26% of the rest are unsure whether they'll take it, and 14% definitely wouldn't. So really an issue with anti-vaxxers. But anyway, vaccines. Let's talk about possible timelines. Now, there's an optimistic timeline, which I don't think will be hit. There's a moderate timeline, and there's a pessimistic timeline. So, optimistic timeline, let's talk about that. This is the ideal case scenario. Wonderful. It's approved by mass production by summer 2021. That means everything goes through trials by the summer of 2021. I told you, first batch of vaccines is in trials right now. So it's approved by summer 2021. Then production, distribution, vaccination would take 6 months. This is assuming the government is really competent, really does a great job, which so far in this pandemic, unfortunately, most government organs have not been very competent in handling the situation. And then we assume that most people will be vaccinated by early 2022. That's the most optimistic scenario. It's very unlikely to happen. I'd say it's less than a 5% chance probability of this, just because of the reality of the situation. Then there's the moderate scenario. This is much more likely. So with the moderate scenario, what you can expect is that a vaccine is approved for mass production by 2023. Sometime this assumes that maybe it will be somewhere by maybe late 2021, maybe 2022, maybe 23, 24, 25. So somewhere between late 2022 and early 2026. So that the midpoint is 2023. And then it'll take about a year. So this is with accounting for lack of full government competence, moderately competent government. Production, distribution, vaccination, it's a year. So most people will be vaccinated by 2024. That's the moderate scenario, 2024. That's a 70% chance scenario. So that encompasses everything from late 2022 to late 2026, with 2024 being the midpoint of that scenario. And then the pessimistic scenario. This would be kind of sucky. So it's approved by mass production by 2026. That assumes that it's surprisingly hard to find a vaccine for COVID-19. It may be possible. It may be more difficult than we expect. So this assumes it's harder to find than we expect. Then again, production, distribution, vaccination will take about a year, and most people will be vaccinated by 2027. Now, this I'd say is about a 25% chance. So it's kind of lower likelihood than the moderate scenario, but still quite possible, unfortunately, because vaccines for coronaviruses are surprisingly hard to find. You might think this is too cynical, but we still don't have an effective vaccine for the flu. The one we have for the flu is only about 50% effective. Cutting the infection rate by 50% for COVID-19 wouldn't really do what we needed to do to address the reality of the serious problems that COVID-19 is causing us, both health and economic. So this is not easy to hear. I'm sure this was not easy for me to hear when I learned about it. I started researching some disaster avoidance experts. So this is what I do. When I saw that this was coming up, I started looking at this information, and I saw that Wuhan in China is a huge major city. We tend to think Wuhan, China, backwood peasants. It's not. It's called the Chicago of China. It's one of the 9 largest cities in China, and it has 11 million people, produces $22 billion of revenue per year, has 500 international flights per day. And that means that it's about 10,000 people who fly in and out. So 10,000 people who take COVID-19 in and out of Wuhan. So this, once I started researching this, I saw that this was going to be a major, serious problem, especially since the Chinese government did not stop it early enough. And so that was really bad. And I saw that it will turn into an epidemic. And I started publishing articles about this, talking to my clients. My clients really had a very difficult time accepting this information as well. So if you have a difficult time, I totally understand where you're coming from. But the thing is, if we don't accept this information, we'll have so much more pain going forward. So the sooner we accept this information and deal with the reality of the situation and start adapting to it and planning for the future, we'll have much less pain and be much better able to accomplish the mission of our nonprofits. So that is the key. The suppression is the only technique that will work. And again, this is not easy to hear, that this is realistically the only option for non-authoritarian societies. Authoritarian societies have other options, which, if you've seen the protests against COVID-19 happening here in the US, people not following safety guidelines, that's an example of where we are not an authoritarian society. So the only option we have is suppression, combination of shutdowns and social distancing. Now, China in Wuhan was able to put locks on people's chains on people's doors to prevent them from going out and staying in. We can't do that here. So this is what we need to do. So in order to avoid overwhelming hospitals, this is what needs to be done. Because if you overwhelm hospitals, the death rate shoots up by about 10 times, from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%. And actually in Italy, the death rate, you might have looked at Italy, the death rate there was over 10%, something like 11 to 12%. The death rate in Italy. So it's pretty terrible. And of course, New York, we still don't know what the death rate was in New York because we don't have the numbers, but it's pretty bad as well. So suppression is extremely costly. It's really tough, but it's our only solution. There are a number of countries that actually did effectively reduce and manage the COVID-19 pandemic, and then through using aggressive suppression. And then they started lifting restrictions. Unfortunately, the number of cases increased. So this was happened in Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, South Korea, and it happened actually in Germany. Germany was one of the great cases of Western countries, major Western countries, very comparable to the US, very diverse, highly economically developed. But unlike the US, it was much better able to manage the pandemic. I think at the last count, it had something like 6,000 deaths compared to here in the US, which has over 50,000 deaths. So much better capable of handling it. But once they started loosening restrictions, there were more cases coming up and they had to reimpose restrictions. And that's what will be happening here. So this is our dynamic. This is what will happen in the future until widespread vaccination. There will be some looser restrictions, and we see a number of states opening up right now. And then there will be an increase in cases to the extent that it's going to be not too far from hospitals being overwhelmed. At that stage, states will have to reimpose restrictions unless they want hospitals to be overwhelmed and then have the same situation as happened in New York City and have the death rates shoot up from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%, which I think very few states will accept that. And then there will be a decrease in cases. And then this cycle will go back and forth. We'll go back to looser restrictions eventually. So everything will cycle back and forward every few months. That's what we're facing, repeating waves of these restrictions and loosenings. So that's what we need to deal with until a vaccine becomes available. So that's the future. And you have to realize this is not a short-term emergency because this is a major disruption of our life. In the most optimistic scenario, the vaccine will only be ready by early 2022, and there's less than a 5% chance likelihood of that happening, where people will be vaccinated, the mass of the people will be vaccinated by early 2022, by the beginning of 2022. Very unlikely. So the world will change forever. In fact, it is changed forever. We just don't realize it. There will be these waves of restrictions that will affect all sorts of ways that people interact with each other, their habits, their values, our desires, our norms. We'll never go back to January 2020. And this is, again, hard to hear, and it's hard for me to accept as well. So I totally understand if that's something you're struggling with. So you want to not plan for the optimistic scenario as you're thinking about going forward. There are too many organizations. They act as though the problem will blow over soon. It'll be over by July, by August, something like that. But hope is not a strategy, which is a great quote attributed to Vince Lombardi. Hope is not a strategy, and you should never plan on hope. So don't plan on the optimistic scenario. Plan for the moderate or pessimistic scenario. We'll talk about how to do that. Now, I want to talk about our decision-making. The pandemic is a slow-moving threat, and this is something that we make really bad decisions about. We're not wired to make good decisions about it. About unusual threats, about slow-moving threats, we don't make good decisions about them because of the neuroscience of how our brain is wired, and that's an area where I'm an expert. Our gut reactions is to greatly underestimate such threats, and this leads to us to endanger our organizations, unfortunately, and that's something that we need to address. In order to help you understand where I'm coming from, my expertise to speak about this topic, let me share a little bit about myself, my expertise, my experience, clients, media, and books. So my experience, I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. It's a small boutique consulting, coaching, and training company. We have 20 years of helping clients in disaster avoidance, risk management, decision-making, strategic planning. And I also spent 15 years in academia studying these topics, all of these disaster avoidance, risk management, decision-making, strategic planning, published in a number of prominent journals, peer-reviewed journals like Behavior and Social Issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology. So that's my background, just so you know that. Now, my clients, I've worked with a whole bunch of clients, mid-sized and large nonprofits, from like the World Wildlife Fund would be one of the larger ones, and foundations like the Columbus Foundation would be one of the larger ones. And of course, those are nationally known names. I could list a whole bunch of smaller ones. Media. I've appeared in a whole bunch of media. Of course, the Society of Nonprofit Professionals journal Nonprofit World. So that one, so props to them. Then Time, Chronicle of Philanthropy, Nonprofit Pro, Nonprofit Time, CBS News, NPR, all those biggies, Scientific American. So that's kind of my thought leadership, just so you know that. And finally, books. So I published a number of best-selling books. I'm probably best known for Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. So that's, of course, nonprofits and for-profits can suffer from business disasters, and that's what I talk about there. Then the blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships. Talks about building better professional and personal relationships. The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide. How can we figure out the truth about the world given our cognitive biases, given the dangerous judgment errors we make? And finally, my newest book, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal, of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. This is obviously what we're talking about here, and it's going to be out on May 15th. So this is just something I'm finishing up. Well, I finished up right now, and it's going to be out pretty soon. So look for that. I'll talk about how you can get content from it if you haven't yet registered for the content. All right, so let's talk about judgment errors. Why is bad advice common? Why do we get such bad advice? Why did Elon Musk give us such bad advice? Why did Goldman Sachs give us such bad advice? It's because of dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases. That's what they're called. That's what scholars like me, researchers like me, call these dangerous judgment errors that come from a combination of our evolutionary background and the wiring of the structures of our brain. Let's talk about these. The fight or flight response to threats. That's part of our evolutionary background. That was life-saving for hunter-gatherers. It was great, very helpful for them, because the risks they faced were intense, in the moment, immediate. Saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response. But it's really dangerous to use this in today's world because the risks we face in today's worlds are long-term, are uncertain. They're much more likely to come from our computer or notifications on our smartphones. And that is a bad fit for the kind of fight or flight response we experience in the savanna environment. Unfortunately, we tend to respond with savanna instincts to modern day threats. And there are specifically three dangerous judgment errors I want to highlight here: the normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. Each of them is a mental tendency that we unfortunately fall into, and these are especially dangerous for the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic or any other slow-moving major train wrecks like that, high-impact train wrecks. We assume that everything will keep going normally. We assume that the future will be much like the past. So we look at the future, next few years, we think, it will be much like the past. Maybe people will use smartphones more, something like that. And unfortunately, that leaves us really underprepared for major risks, for major disruptions. We can't viscerally imagine that the future is going to be very different than the past. And so that's why we underestimate these major disruptors. The future right now with COVID-19 will never be like the past. We'll never go back to January 2020. It will always be different because of what I talked about before, but it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't viscerally feel that way. I feel really uncomfortable even saying this, and I've been talking about this for a while. So it feels very uncomfortable to accept it. It's true, but it's uncomfortable. Planning fallacy. We like ourselves, I like myself, we like our plans. So when we make plans, we think that they'll turn out well. Unfortunately, they often won't because we are too optimistic. We are too confident about ourselves and our plans. So we're not prepared for a lot of problems and risks that will actually occur. We underestimate the resources we need: time, money, information, social capital. You might have heard of the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. This is a misleading phrase. There's a much more effective version of this phrase, which I tell my clients, which is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. You need to focus on figuring out what problems you might face and then addressing them in your plans and pivoting quickly when you run into problems. Finally, hyperbolic discounting. Now, this, again, very understandable why it comes here, where we perceive the short-term future as more important than the long-term future. In the savanna environment, it was really important for us to do that. We couldn't really plan for the long term. If we killed a mammoth, we couldn't really freeze the meat effectively. That's not just something that would work. We couldn't invest into our professional development. What, are you going to become a better X chipper or something? That's not going to work well. What you want to do and think about the long-term future is understand that in the savanna environment, we had the instincts which didn't prepare us for that future, to value the future. Right now, we can invest, of course, into banks. We can buy a house, paid off of over 30 years. We can invest into our professional development by checking out webinars like this one and other forms of professional development. But we don't feel like the future is that important. And that leads us to prioritize the short term to the detriment of the long term, like a lot of organizational leaders are doing right now when they're thinking about, oh, when do I open up? When do I make these, when can I go back to normal? Because they want to, and they don't realize this is such a bad idea. So I'll talk about why. These are the 3 errors I want you to think about avoiding. Now, in order to overcome these dangerous judgment errors, you need to go against your instincts. You need to go against your intuitions. You need to go against your gut reactions, because our intuitions have just evolved to help early humans survive, but they're a bad fit now. So, for example, you've probably already successfully are able to overcome some of your intuitions. One of the fundamental intuitions for the environment of our ancestors was when we came across a source of sugar, we had to eat of it, as much of it as possible. So honey, apples, bananas, whatever. Of course, that was very important in the ancestral environment in order to survive. We're the descendants of those who had a very strong fight or flight reflex, although other people died. We're the descendants of those people who have a very strong eat all the sugar reflex. All the other people didn't survive because they didn't have as much resources. So those who had the drive to eat as much sugar and a strong fight or flight response outcompeted and survived those who didn't. Unfortunately, now the desire to eat as much sugar as possible leads us to eat a box of dozen donuts when they are served. Unfortunately, donuts are served in a box of dozen donuts. That's not great. You should have maybe 1 donut, 2 at most, not a dozen donuts. But when you start eating the donuts, you eat 1, yum yum, you eat 2, yum yum, and then it's very hard to stop from finishing the rest because you've triggered your sugar reflex, and it's very intuitive to finish the rest. So instead of the donuts, you probably know that it's much better to have some fruits, much healthier, but it's very hard for us to not have the donuts because of this triggering. And that's an example where you've probably already learned to overcome this impulse. Also, some haven't. This is why we have the obesity epidemic here in this country, to become physically fit, more physically fit. Your eating is a part of your physical fitness, good decision making about your physical fitness. Now you need to become mentally fit, make good decisions about various situations that are not similar to the savanna environment, like the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, and how do you adapt and plan and prepare for it. So you need to make long-term changes to your plans. You need to think about years, not weeks. And there's a number of ways organizations can prepare by fundamentally changing your organizational model for a future focused on virtual interactions. We'll be much more virtually oriented in the future. And this is why I'll talk about all the dynamics, but you want to think about that. If we are spent 2 years, let's see the most optimistic scenario, yo-yoing back and forth between tighter restrictions, loose restrictions, work at home, work in the office, well, we'll spend much more time at home, and people's lives and habits will be changed to be much more home-oriented. And what I strongly encourage my clients to do is not yo-yo back and forth, not go back to the office when they can and then go back home. There's a lot of issues with it. First of all, you're disrupting routines, you're disrupting processes, you're disrupting dynamics and systems, ways of collaborating together. People are breaking their habits, their schedules. They are going to be much less productive. There's also going to be a number of legal liabilities associated with coming back to the office. And then, if you don't clean it sufficiently, don't maintain strict guidelines, people become sick, die, and then you're on the hook for the money for that situation. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other issues that you don't want to spend your time in the office. You want to switch all to virtual teams. As part of doing so, I strongly encourage you to end your lease. Consider selling real estate for offices, of course. There are some places where you do direct service for nonprofits, and that's something that you don't want to sell those real estates. But where you can, as much as possible, sell that, whether university, the many more students will be online students, sell a number of your real estate, sell a number of your buildings, dorms, and so on. And we could talk about that in the Q&A. But these are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about, and that will free up a serious source of funding, which you will need in this very tough environment. There are 6 areas that you want to think about changing in your internal organizational model as you move to all virtual teams, internal virtual teams. Motivation, engagement, effective communication, resolving conflicts, cultivating trust, cybersecurity, and accountability. Motivation engagement, what's that about? Well, you might have heard from a lot of surveys, a lot of studies, that we have a crisis of engagement and motivation here in the United States. How many employees are actually engaged, motivated? How many are fully engaged and problem solving and creative and passionate about their employer? 34% on average. Of course, more nonprofits than for-profits, but still much less than half, unfortunately, on an average nonprofit. So this is a serious issue where most people, half of the people, perhaps in nonprofits, are just going there to punch the clock, to just do their job, and they will leave pretty quickly if they see a better offer. And that's not great. But it will be even more difficult in the COVID-19 coronavirus situation of working from home. In the initial month or so, people are still in emergency mode. They're still rushing. There's that adrenaline rush. But people can't function in emergency mode that long. They burn out. So they will quickly switch over to functioning in regular mode at home in their virtual setting and through virtual collaboration. What does that mean? Well, there's going to be a lack of motivation from being around other employees. People get motivation from being around others. This is part of the tribalism in that Savannah environment that I mentioned. So we get very strong motivation from being around others doing the same task. And you need to figure out and help your employees replace that motivation when they're alone working virtually. There's also a stress of adjusting to their household during the pandemic. Maybe they have older children who moved back with them after the university closed, or of course, younger children who are staying at home all the time now that school's closed and that summer camps are not opening up. So they have kids crawling all over them. Maybe they're spending 24/7 with their romantic partners, and it's straining them and getting on their nerves. Taking care of older adults who are especially vulnerable to COVID-19 and taking extra precautions not to get them sick. So there's a lot of stress that they're going under. So you need to provide support and guidance to your employees on how to work effectively from home and address motivation engagement. Effective communication is another area that's a big blow in virtual communication. When we go virtual, we change over to much more to text. So it's much more difficult to communicate effectively than in person. Because in text, you switch over to Microsoft Teams, Slack, Asana, Trello, all of these other communication and collaboration tools. They don't work nearly as effectively for conveying body language, tone. It's very different when I say, I think Michael should take this project. When I say, I think Michael should take this project, or I think Michael should take this project. These 3 phrases mean very different things, but when they're written, they're all the same. So a lot of mistakes and miscommunication will happen. And this is something you need to address and avoid. It's essential to train employees on how to communicate effectively in virtual teams in a whole variety of settings. So that's one. That's another area. Now, resolving conflicts. Conflicts, in face-to-face interactions, it's much easier to resolve conflicts. You're humanized, you're standing there, I can see you, I can see when there's anxiety or concern on your face about something I'm saying. I can drop by your office and nip conflicts in the bud. It will happen much less in these nipping problems in the bud, addressing them in virtual settings. So this is something that you really need to address because when I've helped teams transition to virtual settings before COVID-19, I've done that a number of times, there's been a lot more conflicts that people didn't realize that they would happen. So you need to understand that it's much easier for problems to go unnoticed and much harder to solve them effectively in virtual teams. So it's critical to give your employees training on this topic. Now, so those two are issues of training. Let's talk about another one, cultivating trust. You might not have thought about this, but in office interactions, there's a natural way of cultivating trust where you just chat with people, hang out over the water cooler or in the break room, eating donuts that your kind donors sent over. So you chat about your life, your kids, what's going on, your vacation plans, local sports ball team, and something like that. It's not happening in virtual settings. That's not what people do. That's not what happens. So in virtual settings, that humanizing element, that connection, that cultivation of relationships gets lost. And you need to figure out a way of replacing it. This is not a matter of training. This is a matter of creating institutions. And there's a number of institutions that can be created, policy settings that I can talk about in the Q&A. Next, cybersecurity. The FBI has shown that much more hacking is going on right now. First of all, because many more people are working from home and these are less secure environments. So less secure environments, hackers know this, they're doing much more hacking, unfortunately. And the people who are at home, they're not used to following cybersecurity protocols. So not only are the computers, the programs less safe, they have less protection, but they're not following the protocols that they're used to. So this is a matter of training. You need to improve it by providing training and, of course, funding for them to improve their home setup. Cybersecurity. And finally, accountability. Now, in the office environment, there are natural ways to hold each other accountable. So if you're the supervisor, you can walk around, check out what people are doing, make sure they're staying on track, make sure if they're looking confused or lost that you can help them out. And peers can pop in and say, hey, Mary, where's that report you were going to get me yesterday? And when they pop into your cubicle, it's pretty hard to ignore them. But if they send an email, it's much easier to ignore them. So new structures must be created to enable accountability, both this chain of command, up-down accountability, and peer-to-peer accountability. We can talk about this in the Q&A, how to do it. So those are 6 areas for external organizational model. For internal organizational model, let's talk about the external organizational model, which involves, of course, service delivery, relationships, managing disruptions, preparing for major losses, unfortunately, shifting norms, and unknown unknowns. Service delivery. So you want to transition as many of your offerings to virtual as possible. I realize it's hard to do in some settings, but in those you'll need to be socially distanced, but ideally you'll transition to virtual as much as possible. Look for creative ways to achieve your organization's goals. If you used to, for example, hold in-person educational events, hold virtual educational events, just like this webinar. And there are a number of ways of doing so. But unfortunately, it might be better for a number of organizations to suspend services while we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So for example, California right now is using abandoned hotels, not abandoned hotels, hotels that have room because people aren't using them to house poor homeless people and feed them as well. So this is a good time for homeless shelters in California, a number of areas in California, to consider whether they should be really doing their services or whether it's a better use of their mission and their donor time and efforts to temporarily suspend their services, maybe help with the hotel services that are given to homeless people with their expertise and how to provide good care for homeless people, and resume services only after the pandemic is over. That may be the best time, the best use of their resources and for their mission. Relationships. You need to figure out how to cultivate relationships effectively, both existing relationships and establishing new ones. And this is, of course, external stakeholders. So donors, service providers, volunteers, government officials, funders, clients. Government officials are especially important right now, of course, with the stimulus money. You want to invest in professional development for your staff to do this and for your volunteers to do this to the extent that you have volunteers doing this sort of stuff. So your board of directors. You want to manage disruption. So a lot of external stakeholders will not be as savvy as you. They won't be checking out this webinar, and so they will be unprepared for the long-term impact of the pandemic. And so you need to figure out how to protect yourself from them being unprepared. Have a plan B, have backups for issues with various sorts of service providers, vendors. I mean, donors will definitely have issues, volunteers will have issues, and you want to be prepared for addressing these problems. This is hard to say, but every time that there's a major disaster, nonprofits, there's more need, but there's less income coming in. And this will be one of those times. It will be worse than the 2008, 2009 fiscal crisis. And I remember how bad it was for a number of my nonprofit clients. It will be worse. This will just be worse. This is the reality of the situation. You'll have many more losses than seems intuitive to you. It's going to be worse than 2008, 2009 as an anchor. Think about, I don't know how much worse, 2 to 3 times worse than that, but it will be worse. And most people who are thinking about their money right now have not factored in the second wave of the pandemic, which will be very likely to hit in October once the weather gets cooler. It's going to be bad, and people are really not thinking ahead. So they're really way too optimistic about vaccines and so on. They're not thinking that it's likely to be 2024. That's kind of the midpoint 50% scenario that will happen, and that they're not prepared for it. You need to make drastic cuts to your budget right now. I'm very serious about this. You need to make drastic cuts to your budget right now, because otherwise you'll have to make much worse cuts in the future. And this is something I know. Unfortunately, I've seen nonprofits in the past, in 2008, 2009, not make drastic enough cuts when they should have. We can talk about that. Shifting norms. I talked about shifting norms earlier, but here's the strategy behind this. After several years of restrictions and loosenings for 2024, people have very different norms, very different wants, desires, expectations, and habits. And this is something that you can strategically get ahead of. So think about where your nonprofit can fit, where your mission can fit ahead of people's needs, habits, values changing, and prepare for that. Finally, unknown unknowns. There's going to be a whole bunch of unknown unknowns. Now, the pandemic was a predictable disaster. There are ways of turning these unknown unknowns into known unknowns, into known knowns, or known unknowns. So where you know that this is a serious likelihood and you can prepare for it in advance. A number of people, prominent people who are actually really wisely thinking ahead, like Bill Gates, were warning about the possibility of a pandemic for a while. And unfortunately, many financial experts like Goldman Sachs, government leaders were not listening to Bill Gates. And of course, fortunately, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is really doing a great job of advancing money for the pandemic, but you can't have the foundation itself do all that work. So you want to scan the environment for potential major disasters. Look at the work of Bill Gates, look at the work of others, scan the environment for potential major disasters, protect yourself against them. Of course, not everything can be prevented. So here's where a cash cushion can help. And there's going to be a number of disasters that are specifically going to be made worse by the COVID-19 outbreak. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. Finally, let's talk about how you can plan for the long-term impact of the pandemic. And I'll give you an outline of a good approach to planning in the long term. So thinking about possible futures, looking 5 years out, thinking about problems and opportunities, then resources, and then looking at information. So possible futures. Again, 6 strategies. We have 6 strategies for each one. 6 strategies for internal organizational model, 6 strategies for external organizational model, and 6 strategies for planning ahead. Possible futures. You want to plan for a variety of futures and invest resources accordingly. So the optimistic future, vaccine by 2022, the moderate future, vaccine by 2024, and pessimistic, vaccine by 2027, but potentially even later. But let's take 2027. Think about 5 years out. What will your organization look like in each of these scenarios in 5 years? The optimistic, moderate, pessimistic, what will it be like? What will the situation be like? How will you accomplish your mission? How can you get there? So these are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. Then what are going to be the problems in each of these scenarios for your organization? And how can you address them in advance by protecting yourself against them, by protecting yourself against, let's say, external stakeholders failing, and so on. And make a plan for addressing them if they do occur. Some steps you can take right now, so you can cultivate a second batch of people to be on your board of directors if some people drop out, which probably some people will, unfortunately. Or you can make a plan for right now for what to do to address these problems if they come up. So let's say if there's indeed something happens for your nonprofit let's say a potential problem is that you have a gift that's going to someone promised to you for a year from now, and they just doesn't come through because they suffered many more financial losses. They can't do that. Have a way of addressing this in advance. Make a plan for what to do with that, budget cuts, things like this. Opportunities. Of course, there's always going to be some silver linings. So you want to list possible opportunities for each of these scenarios that you might be able to take advantage of, and think of how you can bring them about. I talked about ways of doing so. So for example, some of my clients are approaching their donors right now and saying, hey, this situation, we think it will be worse than it will actually be. So can you make a commitment that if it will be actually worse, then if we don't find a vaccine by early 2022, can you make a commitment in that time to make a donation? So securing these sorts of gifts in advance. We can talk about that. Make a plan to seize these opportunities if they do occur. And that, of course, depends on your unique situation. Resources. Think about the kind of resources you'll need in each scenario. And money, time, information, social capital, strategic planning, good advice, whatever. And make a plan to reserve sufficient resources for the pessimistic scenario. I strongly encourage this. At least the moderate scenario, but ideally the pessimistic scenario, because you want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Don't plan for the optimistic scenario. Don't plan for early 2022. Plan at least for the moderate scenario and the pessimistic one if your resources allow it. Finally, information. Think about what kind of information would lead you to believe each of these scenarios is coming about. Bill Gates, for example, is looking really carefully at this information and specifically providing information through the foundation for nonprofits so it's really well targeted at nonprofits. You might be following Bill Gates, might be following others. Monitor information closely and adjust your plans accordingly. So if it looks like the first batch of vaccines is not working out, then you can be pretty confident that it will not be early 2022 when it will not be the optimistic scenario. And you can be pretty confident about that right now, but you will have more confidence if you see that the first vaccines aren't working out. And if the first vaccines are working out, that's wonderful, that's great. Then you can be more oriented toward that scenario. So, and if you find, then of course, execute against your scenario, execute against your plans. That's what you got to do. This is a tough environment. And this is hard for me to say and hard for you to hear. And this is the reality of the situation. And you need to adapt and plan accordingly for your mission, for the sake of your mission. So I know a number of you already signed up for additional resources. If you didn't yet, you can go to tinyurl.com/de-event and sign up for additional resources from this presentation. You can get a free coaching session with me, and that's part of everyone who signed up already. 2 chapters from my forthcoming book, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, and of course, the assessment on dangerous judgment errors that I promised to send around. So that's the resources, and that's my presentation. I hope that you have found it valuable. If you have questions, please type them in the chat, and then we will get to them. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Tsipursky. I think it's great to hear some sort of candid advice, and I think a lot of people may find it a bit grim or bleak, but I think it's better to prepare for these long-term scenarios than to just assume that everything's going to be good in a month or so and sort of overlook what you need to be doing for your organization to make sure you secure long-term success. So I don't see any questions just yet. If you'd like, you can raise your hand or type a message into the chat box. I don't know if we have any folks out there that have any questions. I guess my first question or my thought would be, what would you say? I know we're looking sort of long term here. What would you say in terms of some of the most important things to do, say in the next week or so, sort of get ahead of this and really start moving forward on the type of planning that you're talking about?
The first thing is to get your stakeholders on board, the internal stakeholders. So get your staff on board. There will be a recording of this webinar that will be sent around. Have them watch it. Make sure that they get on board with realizing this will be a long-term thing. This won't be a months-long thing. This won't be a weeks-long thing. This will be at least until early 2022, much more likely closer to 2023, 24, even 25, if moderate scenario. So you want to be thinking about that. How do you get your stakeholders on board? So first your staff, of course, and then your board of directors, goes up from there. If you are not the executive director, you should not be going to the board of directors. So make sure that your executive director is on board with this. Get your board of directors on board with it, and then start going out to your major donors and volunteers. Depending on the kind of organization you are, you will want to probably most large organizations will want to go to the donors and get them on board with this idea and get them to make a commitment to the organization in the case that, mitigation scenarios say, hey, can you make a commitment in case the situation is going to be worse than you might think it is, than early 2022, than whatever the person happens to think. Most people right now think it'll be over by summer 2021. I mean, some people think it'll be over by this summer. But you want to get these people on board early onwards. So get your internal stakeholders on board and major volunteers, people who spend a lot of time and who are really valuable to you. Then after you do that after you get them on board, you want to think about the long term. So think about the long term. What will the organization look like in the long term, in the moderate scenario? I'd strongly suggest, if you can have the resources, plan for the pessimistic one. But let's say you do have the resources, you're one of those lucky number. Like I said, I work with the World Wildlife Fund, so they do have the resources, and they're right now planning, plan for the pessimistic scenario. So look at that pessimistic scenario and then plan back from that pessimistic scenario. What should you do right now for that plan that includes the pessimistic scenario? So that's what you want to be doing. That's how you want to spend the next couple of weeks. That's the best strategy that I can advise you to spend the next couple of weeks.
Okay. We do have a question here. He said, "Hi, great presentation. Thank you. I know your presentation pertains to orgs. What about individuals trying to break into the job market or independent contractors? I'm thinking of applying many of the advice mentioned here, but resources are much more limited. How do individuals proactively act differently to adapt to this new norm?"
What you want to think about is so I anticipate you're trying to break into the nonprofit market. What you want to do is think about which nonprofits will be most successful in this environment. And those will be nonprofits whose service delivery is most targeted and adapt to the current virtual setting. So think about those nonprofits, educational nonprofits, and so on, which are going to survive and thrive best in the current setting. Like I said, if I was in a homeless shelter, if I was on the board of directors of a homeless shelter, I'd strongly encourage that homeless shelter to right now to suspend its services and preserve the funding and the resources until it's in a better situation to be able to do so. So think about which nonprofits are going to be in the best position to succeed and thrive in the long term. Some of them will not be in the current environment, so just the reality of the situation. And then think about how you can target those nonprofits effectively and position your skills as helping them adapt and plan for the reality of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, depending on your skills. A lot of people, that's on their minds right now. So show them how, through your cover letter, most likely, you can help them most effectively engage with the situation in a way that will help them survive and thrive. So that would be my advice for breaking into the nonprofit market, job market.
Someone else is asking, from a nonprofit standpoint, should we not plan fundraising events for the next 1 to 2 years in person and try online fundraising events only?
Absolutely. So I would strongly encourage you to not plan, definitely not large events. You should not plan any events, any fundraising events within the next year, and definitely not large events within the next 2 years. You can try if we have a situation where there's going to be a super early vaccine, then within 2 years, that's early 2022, then it might be the situation might be such that you can, by that time, plan for a fundraising event in early 2022. But it's a very low likelihood, so you want to monitor the information closely. I just wouldn't take that risk. I mean, I know how much these events cost. They're very expensive. Galas are very expensive. Galas, essentially, they don't make back the money that you spend on them. I mean, most nonprofits that I work with, they don't make back the money or maybe barely cover the money that they spend on the gala. It's mainly a donor cultivation event where donors feel good about each other, they're connected to each other, they're connected to the community. So think about strategies that you can use to replace the functionality of galas, other fundraising events, that you can still achieve those goals through virtual events. And that's what I would strongly recommend. You don't want to put people in dangerous situations. I mean, think about a wealthy donor, how they would feel if they got COVID-19 as a result of coming into fundraising event. That would be terrible. That would be a very, very bad situation. So you don't want that to happen. I would strongly advise against that.
Well, I don't see any other questions here. Dr. Tsipursky, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I think you've given folks a lot of food for thought and things to really consider, in terms of the COVID-19 crisis. We appreciate the insights and the strategies you provided and know they'll be put to good use within our organizations. So thanks again. This concludes today's program. You may now hang up your phone and exit the Zoom platform. Thank you, Dr. Tsipursky.
You're very welcome.